despite centuries of slavery, segregation, and open discrimination, black families in America once stood on a foundation far stronger than many people imagine today. Long before modern welfare systems or civil rights reforms, most black children were raised in two-parent households. Mothers and fathers worked together, often under impossible conditions, to protect their children, pass values, and build stability where the world offered none. This reality challenges one of the most common assumptions in modern discussions about race and poverty. The idea that black families were always fragile or broken simply does not hold up when we look at history. In fact, during the early and mid-20th century, marriage rates among black Americans were high, and extended families played a crucial role in raising children, sharing resources, and preserving dignity in the face of injustice. Family was not just important, it was essential for survival. So the question we must ask is this: if black families survived slavery, Jim Crow, economic exclusion, and daily violence, what changed? When did stability begin to disappear? And why did father-present households become the exception rather than the norm? The answers are not simple, and they are often uncomfortable. They lie only in personal choices, but in policies, economic shifts, and decisions made far away from the communities they affected. In this documentary, we will uncover a hidden chapter of American history, one that connects government policy, economic pressure, and family life in ways rarely discussed. This is not a story of blame. It is a story of cause and effect, of unintended consequences, and of lessons that still matter today. If you value honest history and thoughtful discussion, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that challenge assumptions, reveal overlooked truths, and encourage deeper understanding. Stay with us because what comes next may change how you see this history forever. The strength of black families in the early 20th century did not emerge by accident. It was forged through shared struggle, cooperation, and a deep understanding that survival depended on unity. Yet as the nation began to modernize and the federal government stepped into the role of economic protector, a quiet contradiction took shape. The same system that promised security and stability for American families would, from its very beginning, leave many black households standing outside the safety net. In 1935, as the country reeled from the Great Depression, the Social Security Act was introduced as a lifeline. It was designed to protect workers from the harshest blows of unemployment, disability, and OID. On paper, it sounded like a universal promise. In practice, it was anything but. The law deliberately excluded agricultural and domestic workers from its core protections, categories that, at the time, represented the majority of black employment in the United States. These were not marginal jobs. They were the backbone of the Southern economy and the primary source of income for black families who had already endured decades of segregation and restricted opportunity. This exclusion was not a technical oversight. It was the product of political compromise in a nation still governed by racial separation. Southern lawmakers, determined to preserve the existing social order, ensured that federal assistance would not interfere with local labor arrangements. As a result, millions of black workers who paid taxes, raised families, and contributed to the economy were denied access to retirement benefits, unemployment insurance, and survivor protections that white workers increasingly relied upon. The safety net was being built, but large sections of the population were intentionally left without coverage. For black families who had relied on two incomes, extended kinship networks, and shared responsibility, this exclusion created a dangerous imbalance. While white households began to see government programs as a stabilizing force during economic downturns, black families were forced to continue navigating hardship alone. When illness, injury, or job loss struck, there was no federal cushion to absorb the shock. Stability, once maintained through family cooperation, now faced pressures that unity alone could not fully resolve. As decades passed, the gap widened. Programs intended to support families often operated through state and local governments, where Jim Crow policies still dictated access and enforcement. Assistance was inconsistent, heavily monitored, and often conditional in ways that undermined dignity rather than preserved it. For Black parents who had worked tirelessly to provide structure and continuity for their children, the message was subtle but clear. The system was not built with them in mind. This moment marked a turning point in the relationship between Black families and the federal government. The promise of support existed, but it arrived unevenly, filtered through policies shaped by exclusion. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but a slow erosion. Economic security, once rooted in family bonds and labor, began to depend on institutions that had never fully recognized Black families as equal participants. Over time, this imbalance would interact with later policy expansions, labor market shifts, and social pressures, setting the stage for changes that few could have anticipated. To understand what happened next, it is essential to recognize this foundation. The story of family instability does not begin with cultural failure or personal neglect. It begins with a system that offered protection to some while withholding it from others, quietly altering the conditions under which families were expected to survive. By the early 1960s, Black families were already carrying the weight of decades of exclusion from economic protection. Yet many households continued to rely on marriage, shared responsibility, and community support to maintain stability. This was the moment when federal involvement in daily family life expanded dramatically. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual and profound shift that reshaped how families survived, how relationships formed, and how fatherhood was defined within struggling communities. As welfare programs grew in size and scope during this period, they were presented as temporary support, a bridge meant to help families through hardship until stable work became available. However, the design of these programs often failed to account for the fragile economic position Black families already occupied. Assistance was tied to strict income thresholds and household rules that treated family structure not as a strength to be protected, but as a variable to be monitored. Over time, the presence of a working or employable father increasingly became a liability rather than an asset in the eyes of the system. This created a quiet contradiction within the household. A father might be deeply committed to his children yet unable to secure consistent employment in a labor market that was already closing its doors to him. As manufacturing jobs disappeared and wages stagnated, the difference between survival and crisis often depended on whether a family qualified for assistance. In this environment, marriage no longer guaranteed stability. In some cases, it actively jeopardized access to essential resources. The result was not the rejection of family values, but the postponement of marriage, the informal separation of households, and the normalization of fathers living apart from their children. Statistical changes followed this shift with striking speed. Marriage rates among Black Americans began to decline, and the number of children growing up without a father in the home increased sharply. These trends were often described as cultural transformation, yet they unfolded alongside specific policy incentives that reshaped everyday decisions. When survival depends on compliance, families adapt. Choices that once seemed unthinkable gradually became routine, not because commitment disappeared, but because the cost of maintaining a traditional household grew too high. Within these changing conditions, children experienced a different version of family life than their parents had known. Mothers shouldered increasing responsibility, navigating work, caregiving, and bureaucratic requirements with limited support. Fathers, meanwhile, found their role increasingly uncertain. without stable employment or legal recognition within the household. Many drifted to the margins of family life, still emotionally connected but structurally excluded. The family did not disappear. It fractured under pressure. This period also marked a change in how society interpreted these outcomes. Rather than questioning whether policies were shaping behavior, public discourse often focused on individual responsibility. The decline in marriage and father presence was treated as evidence of moral failure, rather than a response to shifting incentives and shrinking opportunities. Yet when viewed in historical context, the pattern becomes clearer. Family structures were not collapsing in isolation. They were responding to an environment that rewarded separation more reliably than unity. By the end of the 20th century, the consequences of this transformation were deeply embedded. What began as short-term assistance evolved into a long-term redefinition of family life for many Black households. The decline in marriage and father presence did not emerge from a lack of commitment, but from a system that quietly altered the terms under which commitment could survive. As welfare programs expanded and reshaped daily life in struggling communities, one rule quietly became one of the most powerful forces influencing family structure. It was rarely discussed openly, yet its impact was felt inside countless homes. Assistance was often granted only if no adult man was officially present in the household, a condition that transformed fatherhood from a source of stability into a potential risk. What emerged was not a policy designed to break families apart, but one that unintentionally made separation the safer option for survival. For families already living on the edge, eligibility rules created impossible choices. A father might be emotionally invested, actively searching for work, and deeply committed to raising his children, yet his presence could disqualify the household from receiving food assistance or cash support. In these moments, the system forced families to weigh togetherness against basic needs. The decision was not about love or responsibility. It was about whether children would eat, whether rent could be paid, and whether the household could remain intact at all. Under such pressure, absence became a form of sacrifice rather than abandonment. Stories from this era reveal how quietly this separation unfolded. Fathers did not always disappear in dramatic fashion. Some stayed near, sleeping on couches or moving between relatives' homes, maintaining contact while remaining officially invisible. Others withdrew entirely, not because they no longer cared, but because their role had been structurally undermined. Over time, what began as temporary arrangements hardened into permanent patterns. Children grew accustomed to seeing their fathers outside the home rather than within it, and absence became normalized not through neglect, but through policy-driven adaptation. The psychological toll of this shift was profound. Fatherhood is not only about financial provision, it is about presence, authority, and belonging. When men were positioned as obstacles to assistance rather than contributors to family stability, their identity within the household weakened. Mothers, carrying the weight of caregiving and compliance with welfare requirements, often found themselves navigating both parenthood and bureaucracy alone. The family unit remained, but its balance was altered, reshaped by rules that prioritized eligibility over cohesion. As these patterns spread, communities began to change from the inside out. Children raised in households shaped by enforced separation inherited a different understanding of family life than previous generations. Marriage no longer appeared as a practical foundation for stability, but as a risk that could jeopardize access to essential support. Relationships adapted accordingly, favoring informal arrangements over legal or permanent commitments. What once served as a cornerstone of resilience gradually became fragile under sustained pressure. Public discussions of these outcomes rarely acknowledged the role of policy design. Instead, father absence was framed as a cultural problem, detached from the economic and administrative conditions that influenced daily decisions. Yet when examined in continuity with earlier exclusions and later welfare expansion, a consistent pattern emerges. Families responded rationally to incentives placed before them. even when those incentives conflicted with long-held values of unity and shared responsibility. Over time, the requirement that fathers be absent did more than alter individual households. It reshaped expectations across generations. The presence of a father became uncertain, conditional, and sometimes discouraged. What was lost was not simply a person, but a stabilizing structure that had once allowed families to endure far greater external hardships. This shift did not happen because families stopped valuing commitment, but because survival increasingly demanded compliance with rules that made separation feel unavoidable. While welfare policies reshaped family decisions from within the household, a broader economic transformation was unfolding outside its walls. The disappearance of stable industrial employment struck at the very foundation that had long allowed black families to sustain themselves despite limited access to wealth and formal support. For decades, factory work, transportation jobs, and unionized labor had offered a pathway to steady income, predictable hours, and a sense of purpose for men who were often excluded from higher education and professional careers. When those jobs vanished, the consequences rippled far beyond the factory floor. Beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s and 1980s, manufacturing closed or relocated, taking with them the backbone of urban employment. Cities that once promised opportunity became symbols of abandonment as machines replaced workers or operations moved overseas. For black men, who were disproportionately represented in industrial roles due to historical barriers in other sectors, the impact was immediate and severe. A job loss was not merely a temporary setback. It often meant permanent exclusion from comparable work. This economic shift collided with the welfare system in ways that intensified family instability. Employment had long functioned as the anchor of household structure. Reinforcing marriage, shared responsibility, and long-term planning. When stable work disappeared, that anchor loosened. Men who had defined their role through provision now faced long periods of unemployment or underemployment, not because of a lack of effort, but because the labor market had moved beyond their reach. Without access to retraining or education, many found themselves locked out of the new economy taking shape around them. Inside the home, the effects were quietly transformative. Financial strain increased, and the ability to plan for the future diminished. Marriage, once seen as a practical and achievable goal, began to feel risky under conditions of economic uncertainty. The absence of reliable income undermined confidence and strained relationships, particularly when combined with welfare rules that treated unemployment as disqualification rather than hardship. Families were caught between a shrinking job market and a support system that offered assistance only under restrictive conditions. Communities felt these changes collectively. Neighborhoods built around factories lost not only jobs, but also social cohesion. Local businesses closed, schools suffered from declining tax bases, and informal support networks weakened. Children growing up in these environments inherited uncertainty as a constant presence. The link between work and family stability, once reinforced through daily routine and shared responsibility, became increasingly abstract. Employment was no longer a guarantee of dignity or security. It was an unpredictable opportunity. As time passed, the narrative surrounding these changes shifted. Economic displacement was often reframed as individual failure rather than structural transformation. The loss of industrial work was treated as an inevitable outcome of progress, while the communities most affected were left to absorb the consequences without meaningful investment. For black families already navigating welfare rules that discouraged cohesion, the collapse of stable employment removed one of the last pillars supporting long-term stability. What emerged was a cycle difficult to escape. Without jobs, family structures weakened. Without strong family structures, economic recovery became harder. The foundation that had once allowed black families to endure discrimination and exclusion began to erode. not through a single policy or decision, but through the combined force of economic abandonment and institutional neglect. Deindustrialization did not simply remove jobs. It reshaped the conditions under which families could survive, altering the meaning of work, responsibility, and stability for generations to come. As economic displacement and policy pressures reshaped family life, the most enduring consequences appeared not immediately, but gradually. In the lives of children, father absence did not arrive as a single moment of loss. It unfolded over years, shaping daily routines, expectations, and emotional development. What began as an adaptation to hardship slowly became a defining feature of childhood for many, influencing outcomes long after the original causes faded from view. In households without a consistently present father, the strain was often subtle at first. Mothers worked tirelessly to fill every role, balancing caregiving, employment, and the demands of navigating assistance systems. Yet time and energy are finite resources. When one adult shoulders the full weight of responsibility, stress accumulates quietly, affecting the emotional climate of the home. Children absorb this tension even when it goes unspoken. Stability becomes fragile, and small disruptions carry outsized consequences. Over time, patterns emerged that researchers would later document. Children raised without fathers were more likely to experience economic hardship, not simply because of reduced income, but because single-parent households had fewer buffers against crisis. A missed paycheck, an illness, or an unexpected expense could trigger cascading problems. Poverty in this context was not just a lack of money. It was a constant state of uncertainty that shaped how children viewed the future and their place within it. Schools became another arena where these effects surfaced. Without consistent guidance and reinforcement at home, many children struggled to stay engaged in environments already strained by underfunding and overcrowding. Dropping out was rarely an impulsive decision. It was often the culmination of years of disengagement, compounded by the absence of a stable adult presence to intervene early. Education, once seen as a pathway forward, began to feel disconnected from immediate survival. Mental and emotional challenges also took root beneath the surface. Children without fathers were more likely to experience anxiety, difficulty regulating emotions, and challenges forming trust-based relationships. The absence itself was not the sole cause. Rather, it was the uncertainty surrounding it. Questions went unanswered, routines shifted, and expectations remained unclear. Without a consistent model of authority and support, many children learned to navigate the world defensively, prioritizing short-term security over long-term planning. In neighborhoods already affected by job loss and reduced investment, these individual struggles intersected with broader social pressures. Exposure to violence, limited access to counseling, and overstretched community resources amplified the risks. For some adolescents, involvement in harmful behavior became less about defiance and more about belonging or survival. These outcomes were later cited as evidence of moral decline, yet they were deeply connected to the structural conditions shaping childhood development. What is often missed in these discussions is the cumulative nature of the impact. Father absence did not simply affect one generation. It influenced how children understood family, responsibility, and opportunity as they became adults themselves. The challenges they faced were not the result of a single missing figure, but of a system that gradually weakened the supports families relied upon to raise resilient children. When viewed alongside earlier policy decisions and economic shifts, these outcomes form a coherent pattern rather than a coincidence. Children responded to the environments they were given. Their struggles reflected not a lack of potential, but the weight of instability carried from one stage of life to the next. Understanding this connection is essential, not to assign blame, but to recognize how deeply family structure, economic security, and child development are intertwined. By the mid-1990s, Concern over welfare had reached a turning point in American politics. Decades of economic restructuring, rising inequality, and public frustration set the stage for a major shift in policy. The result was the replacement of aid to families with dependent children with temporary assistance for needy families, a reform that promised to restore self-reliance and reduce long-term dependency. On the surface, the change appeared decisive. Beneath it, however, the deeper conditions that had shaped family instability remained largely untouched. TANF introduced strict time limits, work requirements, and compliance rules that fundamentally altered how assistance functioned. Families were now expected to transition quickly into employment, regardless of whether stable jobs were available. The emphasis shifted from support to supervision, from protection to enforcement. Welfare roles declined sharply in the years that followed, and this reduction was often celebrated as evidence of success. Yet the numbers told only part of the story. Fewer people receiving assistance did not necessarily mean fewer people in need. For families already struggling with the long-term effects of job loss and weakened household structures, the new system introduced additional pressure. Assistance became temporary by design, even when hardship was not. Mothers faced deadlines that did not account for the realities of low-wage work. Unstable schedules, or limited access to childcare. Missing a requirement could result in immediate loss of support, pushing families further into crisis rather than guiding them toward stability. Survival increasingly depended on navigating rules rather than addressing underlying barriers. The reform also intensified existing challenges for fathers on the margins of family life. Child support enforcement grew stricter, often without parallel investment in employment opportunities or training. Men who were already disconnected from stable work found themselves facing penalties that deepened their exclusion. Instead of repairing the relationship between employment, family, and responsibility, the system reinforced separation through punishment rather than support. The cycle that had begun decades earlier continued under a new framework. Communities felt the effects in ways that were not immediately visible in policy reports. As cash assistance declined, reliance shifted toward informal networks, short-term work, and emergency services. Families survived, but often at the cost of long-term security. Housing instability, food insecurity, and untreated stress became more common, even as official welfare participation fell. Structural poverty did not disappear. It simply became harder to measure. Public narratives surrounding TANF often framed the reform as a moral correction, emphasizing personal responsibility while overlooking historical context. The economic landscape that families were expected to navigate had not fundamentally improved. Many of the industrial jobs that once provided stability were gone, and the new labor market offered low wages with little protection. Expecting rapid independence under these conditions placed families in an impossible position, measuring success by compliance rather than by well-being. In the years that followed, the limitations of this approach became clearer. Reduced assistance did not translate into upward mobility for the most vulnerable households. Instead, it exposed how deeply poverty was embedded in structural factors beyond individual control. TANF changed the appearance of the welfare system, but it did not resolve the forces that had weakened families over generations. The reform closed one chapter while leaving the underlying story unfinished, revealing that limiting aid without rebuilding opportunity can never fully address the roots of economic hardship. Today, the story does not end with past policies or historical reforms. The forces that reshaped black families continue to operate, often in quieter and less visible ways. Wage gaps remain a persistent reality, limiting how far hard work alone can carry a household. Even when education levels rise and employment is secured, earnings often fall short of providing true stability. This gap does more than reduce income. It restricts the ability to plan, to save, and to pass security from one generation to the next. Housing, long recognized as the foundation of family wealth, remains another barrier. Patterns established decades ago continue to shape where families live, what they can afford, and how much equity they can build over time. Homeownership, which helped many families accumulate stability and security in the 20th century, remains less accessible to Black households. Without this anchor, families are more vulnerable to economic shocks, and children grow up without the long-term benefits that stable housing can provide. Instability in housing often means instability in schools, neighborhoods, and social networks, reinforcing cycles that are difficult to break. Wealth inequality deepens these challenges. Savings, investments, and inherited assets create a buffer that allows families to absorb hardship without collapsing. When that buffer is missing, every setback carries greater risk. Medical emergencies, job interruptions, or rising living costs can quickly destabilize a household. This constant pressure affects family life in ways that statistics rarely capture, shaping decisions about marriage, childrearing, and long-term commitment. Stability becomes harder to achieve not because of a lack of effort, but because the margin for error is so small. Together, these forces continue to influence family structure today. They shape who feels secure enough to form lasting partnerships and who must focus on immediate survival. They affect how children experience their early years and how adults imagine their future. The patterns seen in earlier decades did not disappear. They evolved, adapting to new economic realities while carrying forward the weight of old inequalities. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or revisiting grievances. It is about recognizing how deeply policy, economics, and family life are connected. Families respond to the conditions they are given. When opportunity is limited and stability is fragile, even the strongest bonds are tested. Acknowledging this truth opens the door to more thoughtful conversations about solutions that strengthen families rather than divide them. Thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect on this story. If you found this documentary meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring history with honesty and depth, bringing overlooked stories to light and encouraging conversations that matter.